Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. This is David Myers, host of the podcast. Our guest today is Isaac Stanley-Becker, a reporter on intelligence and national security issues for the Washington Post and author of an important new book, Europe Without Borders, just published by Princeton University Press. The book tells the story of the rise and partial fall of the Schengen Zone, the area of free movement created by members of the European community in 1984 and 85 that was intended for citizens of European countries. The Schengen Zone was explicitly not intended for non-citizens, outsiders, or immigrants without papers. Today, as member states of the European Union, and of course the United States, hold deeply divisive debates over immigration and who should be permitted to cross the national borders, it is important to recall the ideal of a Europe without borders, where it came from, who supported it, and who was and wasn't included in it. Isaac Stanley-Becker has offered a compelling account of that ideal and the place of the Schengen Zone in fostering it. He joins us on Then and Now to discuss this tale and what it can tell us about immigration debates today. Welcome to Then and Now, Isaac.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us why you wrote a book about Europe Without Borders.
Well, I began work on this project shortly after Brexit and in the midst of some pretty interesting elections on the continent, elections that were roiled by questions of immigration and border security and terrorism. And I became interested in the origins of some of these issues, which brought me back to the Schengen Agreement of 1985. It was then that I realized that there hadn't really been a history of Schengen written for the most part because many diplomatic records are embargoed for 30 years. So much of the diplomatic records and treaty making had never been looked at before. And my day job is as a journalist, and we prize being first and having first access to records or individuals or information. And so I saw this as a kind of historical scoop, and I went from there.
And here you really mix, in some sense, the functions of the journalist and the historian. You sort of both write the first draft of history and then sort of write the second draft of history. Journalists often are told, it's often said, write the first draft of history. And here you're functioning as an historian as well. Did you consciously feel that you were sort of mixing those tasks as journalist and historian?
I do think so. The book melds different kinds of methods and forms of research. It's rooted in archival material, largely in the initial signatory states. So especially in France and Germany as the two drivers of the agreement in the interior ministries and foreign affairs ministries of those two countries, that's where I found diplomatic memoranda, notes, telegrams, handwritten letters, and other materials that record the treaty-making process. But I tried to combine that with some oral history, conducting interviews with a number of the key negotiators who fortunately were still alive. And I thought that really enlivened some of the material because the arcana of the negotiations can be somewhat technical. And I thought that the reflections of the treaty makers was really helpful, both in terms of providing some more detail and kind of context and color about what they were up to, but then very usefully in getting their retrospective observations about this work and what it had amounted to and what they thought of it now. I mean, one of the themes of the book is in some ways unintended consequences or not fully understanding or reckoning with the effects of what Schengen meant or what it allowed. So one treaty maker in particular, Catherine Lalumiere of France, was explaining how they saw this as pretty straightforward work, continuing from the Treaty of Rome, allowing just simply a matter of convenience. And it was only later, I mean, in the 90s or even in the 2000s, when they realized that Schengen had become this symbol, a symbol of liberty for its supporters, and a symbol of the ills of immigration and the ills of globalization to its detractors.
Right. I want to get at that kind of double meaning of Schengen, but perhaps we should begin at the beginning. Many visitors to Europe sort of see signs allowing those who are EU passport holders to enter the Schengen Zone area when they reach an airport. So can you tell us actually where is Schengen and how did the Schengen Zone come about?
Well, today Schengen is vast. Just as of this year, it encompasses Romania and Bulgaria, the newest entrants of 29 European countries, much of the EU, though not all of it, and then some non-EU states. But it began as a much smaller configuration. It was five countries: France,
And
West
Schengen
Germany.
itself, we should say, is a town in Luxembourg, if I'm not
My
mistaken.
apologies. That's right. Well, and the usage here, there's a Schengen is referred to the space. It's the treaty, and then of course Schengen is an actual place, a very small place, which I had the chance to visit. It's a small town in Luxembourg, right at the border with France and Germany, along the Moselle River in winemaking country. It's actually an extraordinarily beautiful part of Western Europe. The vineyards and the river running through it. It's quite a beautiful location, but rather unremarkable, except for giving its name to this treaty, and it's become known in that way, even though many people do not realize that it's an actual place. Um, but five initial countries, diplomats from those countries met there in 1985: France, West Germany, and the Benelux states of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And they were the initial Schengen countries. And then by the time the implementing convention was approved in 1990, there were other states that had sought accession. So, Italy was an early one, Spain fairly soon. And by the time the treaty takes effect in 1995, it's a larger group. And then it, in some ways, follows the kind of timeline of broader EU accession. So in 2004, there's the Eastern enlargements. A couple of years later, after a fairly onerous process of proving that they can control their external borders, you have some of those states join Schengen. So Poland, the Czech Republic, so on and so forth. And then it's grown since then. Just in recent years, Croatia, and just this year, Romania and Bulgaria. So now 29 countries, a really vast swath of the continent.
I'm interested in having you situate Schengen in the arc of this post-war vision of Europe that begins, in some sense, in 1952 with the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community, and then moves forward to 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty, another town immortalized by a decision made by a coalition of European countries that established the European Union. So we see this arc of this post-war vision. Where does Schengen fit into that vision of a unified Europe? What is its role, do you think, in sort of moving forward that project?
Well, we could start in the post-war period, but actually we could start much, much earlier, centuries earlier. We could start with Kant and his ideas about cosmopolitanism. We could talk about Victor Hugo and his ideas about pan-Europeanism. So much, much earlier, there were thinkers in the Enlightenment, the Romantic period, who are conceptualizing a European existence and civilization that would encompass and sort of be broad enough to include various parts of Europe. And some of this was conceptualized as this developed as a hedge against the United States, or a hedge against Russia or other powers. And this develops in an interesting way in the interwar period, when there are ideas about a United States of Europe and other federal notions. World War II obviously puts an end to that kind of multilateral cosmopolitan thinking, because Hitler's vision is an internationalism of a very, very different sort. And so in the post-war period, we see some of this get resuscitated. But the vision that is enshrined by the Treaty of Rome is largely a commercial one. It's about rejuvenating the economies of
Treaty of
Western
Rome is
Europe.
1957.
That's right, 1957, rejuvenating the economies, establishing a customs union, allowing the free circulation of capital goods and, crucially, workers, people engaged in economic exchange. Then what I argue is that Schengen comes and it plays quite an interesting role. Now, first, it's negotiated outside of the European Union. So it's not initially an EU treaty. It's done outside of EU institutions. And this is important because what is realized is that there's no actually authority to create a kind of broader guarantee of free movement based on the Treaty of Rome. There's a reading of the Treaty of Rome that it provides for this as kind of an economic grant for people engaged in commercial pursuits, and it's a strict kind of economic paradigm of free movement. And so Schengen acts as a kind of laboratory for other ideas about free movement, where it would expand beyond the area of the market and also crucially beyond the individual nation, because there had been human rights covenants and others that had said that people have a right to leave one's country and to return to one's country, freedom of travel within a given country. But Schengen goes beyond that. It says among countries, and then it also goes beyond the Treaty of Rome and saying not just workers, not just people engaged in economic pursuits, but people qua people. So this is negotiated in 1984, 1985, as there is simultaneously planning going on within EU institutions for the completion of the single market. And so from the beginning, Schengen is understood as a kind of laboratory for ideas about free movement that would serve both economic aims and also more civic, humanist aims. And the two in some ways go hand in hand. Part of what I found is that Schengen, precisely in going beyond a commercial paradigm of free movement, created legitimacy for the completion of the single market and that economic aim by providing a kind of civic underpinning and humanist rationale for this and lodging the utility of the internal market within a broader kind of cosmopolitan community.
So what that laboratory that you're speaking of was intended to produce was, as you note in the book, a citizens' Europe. And I'm wondering if, in fact, Schengen plays a vital role in the transformation of what had been largely, as you've described it, an economic unit into a political entity that would ultimately manifest in political institutions like a parliament, an executive, and a judiciary. Is Schengen a vital crux in that, or lever in that transition from an economic to a political vision of a unified Europe?
I think it is a really important aspect of that. And certainly there are others. You mentioned the Maastricht Treaty, which goes much further in elaborating some of these other functions of the European Union. But in any number of ways, Schengen is really critical. So not only just in this sense of free travel for people as people, but really importantly, Schengen is important in hastening the development, say, of the Erasmus program, the program that allows students to move and study at other European universities and other European countries. Coming out of Citizens Europe, which actually was a European Council summit where the French president, François Mitterrand, proclaims this vision, there are working groups that are set up that say, let's have a European flag and let's have a European anthem and let's have sports teams and other kinds of cooperation and engagement that will go beyond the economic. But again, it's understood that there is limited authority for some of this coming out of the Treaty of Rome because it's largely an economic paradigm. And Schengen is important in taking some of this outside of the EU institutions, developing a kind of civic sense of free travel and a European identity and European citizenship, even that then again gets kind of put back into EU treaties, whether in the Maastricht Treaty or at the very end of the 20th century, Schengen does become inscribed in EU law through the Amsterdam Treaty, 1997.
You mentioned François Mitterrand, the French president, and indeed he and Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, are important figures in your book, representing long-standing rivals in two of the most important countries in the world and certainly in Europe. Can you talk about the role of both Mitterrand and Kohl in the process of evolution that you describe in the book?
Yeah, France and Germany were in the driver's seat, and I think it's the role of these two statesmen and national leaders was extremely important in representing and kind of standing in for the unity between these two one-time adversaries. And both were keenly aware, and this came through in letters between them, but then also some of the other diplomatic paperwork and treaty making. Both were keenly aware of the a kind of obligation or sense of purpose emanating from that broader reconciliation coming out of the war. And before Schengen is instituted among the five countries, there's a bilateral agreement between France and West Germany in 1984 that precedes it and has much of the same function. So France and West Germany are already cooperating in this way. And each has interests and faces pressures of their own. So Mitterrand at this time in the mid 80s is beginning to reckon with the rising electoral power of the far right, the National Front in his country, and that's of concern. Along with some domestic issues. There's cohabitation in France at this time. In other words, the president is of one party and the prime minister of another because of factions in parliament. And in West Germany, the continuing normalization of that country into the European community, and also, very crucially, toward the end of the 80s and into the 90s, the question of East Germany, which kind of erupts in the Schengen negotiations in a really profound way. And all of a sudden, there's this sense of German power and Germany's place on the continent and place in Schengen, because all of the Schengen work had envisioned just West Germany. It had not envisioned initially a reunified Germany.
Right. I want to talk about that in a minute, but one of the things that struck me when I was reading about both Kohl and Mitterrand in the book was the personal dimension and the way in which their commitment to this vision of a more unified Europe may be in some sense an expiation, a process of expiation for both of them, of the sins of their youth. Mitterrand's relatively recently disclosed involvement in Vichy and Kohl's participation in the Hitler Youth. Did that thought cross your mind?
It did, and I wanted to reflect some sense of those origins. The book did not allow going into detail about their upbringing or youths or prior experiences, but as you note, Mitterrand was for a time a Vichy official, and then ultimately joined the resistance and rose in the ranks of the Socialist Party. And then, Kohl was in the Hitler Youth and, removed burned bodies from the ashes, I think, in the Ruhr region. So they each had this foundational and perhaps scarring experience in the Second World War, and were committed to a kind of Franco-German reconciliation in a way that, it's interesting because we've as Europe today grapples with questions about who its leaders are and where the proper alliances are, and the exit from the stage of Angela Merkel and sort of the rise of Macron, but then obviously his wings have been clipped. Some of these questions about where does power lie in Europe and what kind of historical obligations or relationships are animating that.
Right. So all the while that they're sort of attempting this reconciliation, these two longstanding foes, in the name of a unified vision of Europe, there is emerging this notion that's quite beautiful of a Europe without borders, a Europe of its citizens. And yet lurking beneath the surface is this large pool of people designated as sans-papiers. So the vision is beautiful for those who qualify as nationals, those who are citizens of the various countries that make up the European Union. It's much less beautiful for those who are not citizens of the countries, who may be in those countries as laborers or, in fact, as undocumented immigrants. And that, in some sense, is the great drama in the book, the juxtaposition that emerges out of what would seem on the face of it to be this beautiful vision. So can you say a word about the category of the sans-papiers, those without papers?
And I think really importantly, this is not a betrayal or an unmet promise of Schengen. This is how it was envisioned from the outset by its architects. It was a Europe without borders and a citizens' Europe, meaning for citizens of European community and then European Union member states, designed always to exclude outsiders from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, at that time, certainly Eastern Europe. There was great concern about outsiders from Eastern Europe. And so the enabling of internal freedom of movement was always seen as being paired with a hardening of external barriers and restrictions against outsiders. So sans papier, without papers, is what French undocumented immigrants begin calling themselves in the 1990s, and this initiates a kind of social movement protesting against some of these terms that spreads across Europe and in fact around the world. But before immigrants designated themselves as such, there was a word that the treaty makers used to designate people from the outside, and that was the undesirables. So they spoke of countries whose citizens or nationals were undesirable, and they ranked these countries according to levels of risk for immigration risks of migratory flows and also security risks. And the list of these countries just runs it's China, Yugoslavia, many countries in Africa, certainly, the former colonies of the initial Schengen member states. And so that, undesirable was the way the outsiders were designated by the Schengen treaty makers. And that kind of exclusion paired with the internal freedom is really at the core of Schengen. And, one could see that as a contradiction, but actually its treaty makers saw it as what enabled Schengen, because you could only allow internal freedom if there's exclusion from on the outside.
Right. And what pushes this tension to the fore, it seems, in addition to large numbers of immigrants who were not citizens making their way to European countries, was the fall of the Berlin Wall, as you suggested in 1989, when a whole new class of undesirables is knocking at the door of this beautiful new edifice. Can you talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall and that class of undesirables, those from Eastern Europe, beginning with East Germans?
Right. So, initially Berlin had barely figured in the negotiations. West Berlin had been technically included in Schengen because in addition to movement by land and I guess sea, there was, air travel was included in this. So West Berlin is technically part of Schengen, but certainly not East Berlin and East Germany. But it had really been a minor point in the negotiations. All of a sudden, 1989, the peaceful revolutions happen, and there's mass protests and revolutionary upheaval across the Soviet bloc, including in East Germany. The wall falls in November of 1989, and some 3 million people crossed into West Berlin at that moment. And it halts the Schengen negotiations because all the planning had assumed a divided Germany. It had assumed Schengen's eastern border being the internal German border. And all sorts of concerns arise, not just about the question of East Germans, but also immigrants from elsewhere in the Soviet bloc coming into East Germany, coming into East Berlin, moving into West Berlin, and then this being a kind of way station for all sorts of, again, quote unquote, undesirables from across Eastern Europe. So the treaty was supposed to be signed and finished at the end of 1989, but there's an impasse, and it's what the new German question, the famous German question, all of a sudden emerges within Schengen as posing these problems to free movement. And at the time, the irony of this is not lost on the treaty makers or on the press, which realized that the very kind of purpose stated mission of Schengen, opening borders, allowing free movement, has become its key challenge or a stumbling block. That you want to dismantle borders, all of a sudden this border collapses, this symbolic border collapses, and it becomes almost fatal to Schengen. And really, the crucial question is what will the position of Germany be within Schengen? So West Germany wants all of these stipulations that East Germany is not going to be treated as a foreign country, that visa restrictions will be waived, and so on and so forth. And initially, there's some resistance to this, foremost by France, where memories of a kind of powerful Germany in the middle of the continent are fairly fresh, and there's a fair amount of hesitation. Ultimately, it's acknowledged that there's little that can stop this from happening. Elections happen in East Germany in early 1990, brings to power factions that are favorable toward reunification, and Schengen is actually ultimately, quite interestingly, the first international agreement that speaks to German reunification. In the Schengen Implementing Convention signed in June 1990, there are stipulations about pending German reunification. Both parts of, the once divided Germany will be part of this agreement, and East Germany will not be a foreign country with respect to West Germany. So it ultimately all happens quite rapidly, but it poses briefly this kind of existential challenge to Schengen, which I think really speaks to some of the risks and kind of paradoxes of allowing free movement, yet being terribly concerned about what the reality of free movement actually means.
Right, and it seems to expose the original notion of Schengen, which is that this should be a free zone for wealthy white capitalist Europeans. Is that too harsh a rendering of what Schengen was envisaged as?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's, notably, Schengen does not provide a right of residence. It's a right to travel or guarantee of free travel without hindrance at the borders. But at times, because travel is so linked to residence, this does arise in some of the discussions. And whenever the issue of residence is brought up, it's always a question of people not becoming a public charge and whether care can be taken, that there's adequate resources, that these people are salaried or employed in some way. So I think you're right to point to the concerns about kind of the world's dispossessed and certainly not being the intended beneficiaries of free movement under Schengen, that's for sure.
And in thinking of the legacy of Schengen, I'm wondering how you assess another monumental development that took place in Germany in 2015, when Angela Merkel, the German chancellor at the time, agreed to take in a large number of Syrian refugees, making the claim that wir schaffen das, we can do this. It's not a direct connect to Schengen, but it does say something about this vision of open borders that seems quite different from the Schengen vision, or it says something about Germany's role in expiating its own sins. How might one understand Merkel's decision in light of European immigration policy and the idea of a free zone?
Well, I think it's also critical too because it it makes abundantly clear that when there's a decision by one Schengen member state to open its borders and not impose restrictions, that if the other countries adhere to the tenets of Schengen, then there is a certain amount of mobility of all of those people within this porous area of free movement. So I think it's critical in terms of speaking to just what Schengen allows in the most extreme sense. I mean, I do think of 2015 refugee crisis as being the really the moment that the kind of current crisis of Schengen begins. And then we've seen an essentially unending crisis since then, whether in other kinds of migratory pressures or certainly COVID in 2020, and then the Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, and just seemingly unending kind of global shocks that all pose a risk to Schengen. So and this operates on two planes in terms of what I mean by the crisis. There is the crisis in terms of the concern and the risk of free movement across Schengen's borders by people who are not its intended beneficiaries or by people who are carrying a pathogen that is of concern to people in other countries. But then there's also the, willingness and just practice of reinstituting border controls in a just sweeping and really systematic way. So Germany, yes, does not shut its borders and allows this large number of refugees in or asylum seekers in 2015, but then really, really quickly, and this is still only being kind of recognized in some of the accounts of how quickly that Germany then shuts its borders and is one of the first European countries and the first Schengen countries to institute just absolutely sweeping border checks in seeming contravention of Schengen. Now, it's written into the Schengen Treaty that the member states have a right to derogate from its terms, reinstitute border checks. But it says, for reasons of national security or public policy, okay, that's fairly vague. But importantly, it's supposed to be temporary, and the other states are supposed to get notification of this in advance. And that has certainly not happened. So just thinking about the present day where Germany has reinstituted border checks at all of its land borders, and the other states are operating similarly, I think there's a kind of amazing irony that, as I mentioned, Bulgaria and Romania are just part of Schengen as of this year, and they already have reinstituted checks in certain places between them because of various migratory pressures or other risks. So we've seen what I refer to, or I think of as the kind of death of Schengen by a thousand cuts, just that this willingness to reintroduce controls and dispense with free movement when necessary, which now seems to be basically at every moment, is a real challenge to this vision and to this system.
Even though that exclusionary impulse always existed within Schengen, right? The sans-papiers, and so much of the last decade of crisis in Europe has been driven by the fear of the immigrant. So it seems lurking in the Schengen Agreement is this exclusionary impulse, often covered over by the beautiful vision of a citizen's Europe.
I think that's partially true, but I would make somewhat of a distinction, and the two certainly are intertwined and blur to an extent. But I think that there is within Schengen, and we've seen, especially in the kind of 2015 through 2018, 2019 period, an absolute willingness to harden external borders, set up detention facilities at Europe's periphery, and just be absolutely ruthless in terms of trying not to allow asylum seekers or other kinds of migrants into Europe. And this really is the kind of world that Schengen made, of trying to preserve internal freedom of movement by building what's called a fortress Europe. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, though there were foreshadowings of this earlier, is something somewhat different, which is hardening within Schengen and a willingness to dispense at a large scale, not just in terms of spot checks for, say, the World Cup or other events, but sweeping systematic checks reintroduced for a prolonged period. And I think that's somewhat different, and it reflects a kind of backlash to this very vision of free movement, to globalization, and a concern about immigration that has so destabilized European democracies, just as it's destabilized the US.
And I would seem to me that Orban's Hungary would be a leader in that countervailing movement against the sort of more cosmopolitan vision of a unified Europe. And his presence in the EU seems to be a source of constant tension. Does he figure in this undoing, as it were?
Well, I think that Orban would say that he's been proved right, and that other European leaders are catching up to his approach and to his thinking. So I mentioned this moment in September when Germany says all land borders, I think it's 8 land borders, renewed checks, and Orban reposts whatever announcement comes out from the Interior Ministry in Germany. He reposts it on Twitter and basically says, kudos. This is terrific. This is the way it's done. So we are seeing a kind of move toward Orban's approach to immigration and borders.
Yeah. So you kind of summarized the state of affairs in a recent op-ed in the New York Times, where you said, Schengen once symbolized liberal internationalism, a landmark of the European unity built after World War II. Today, it's a symbol of Europe's migration crisis, a crisis driving the backlash against globalization and the ascendance of illiberalism. Where do you think we're going?
Well, I think Schengen has always been a bête noire for the far right. There's an interesting moment, kind of moment of theatrical moment in 2014 where one of the leaders of the National Front in France goes to Schengen and lays a wreath by the where the agreement was signed, performing death rites for Schengen. So it's always been criticized by the far right. But I think, as we were just saying, it's now endangered by mainstream centrist parties in Europe. So I think we are moving into a somewhat different phase. At the same time, I've been pretty interested in some opinion research that shows that freedom of travel remains a really, really popular aspect of the EU to EU citizens, that people like being able to go to live in Basel and go shop in Germany or France. They like the Erasmus program, being able to study in other places, to work, travel, marry across borders. So I don't want to overstate the backlash or suggest that this is all being scrapped wholesale, but I think it's Schengen is in a really unpredictable and precarious position. And I think some of it may depend on some of the external migratory pressures, whether Europe can come up with a kind of burden sharing system for asylum, which has so eluded them thus far and been such a source of consternation internally about how they divide the responsibilities for asylum seekers, that if something can be done to manage that in a more effective way and take some of the political pressure off, that it would mean that Schengen could be sustained in a more kind of coherent way. But I think as long as that the immigration issue has been so politicized and there's such a potential political cost to be extracted from parties who don't present themselves as tough on immigration, I think Schengen is a really easy target.
Hmm. So, as a final and admittedly very big question, especially as we enter the era of Donald J. Trump 2.0, I'm wondering about what this evolution that you described, the rise and perhaps partial fall of the Schengen zone, or at least its modification, tell us about the roiling debate over immigration in the United States. Do you see parallels between the two, and specifically in thinking about Schengen's role? Obviously, there are parallels in terms of the rise of a new illiberal populism and an anti-immigrant fury in both places. But does Schengen tell us anything about the debate over immigration in the United States that we could benefit from learning about?
I think there's certainly similarities, but also, of course, stark differences between the way that Schengen operates and the U.S. southern border, which is distinctive in so many ways, and also the U.S. system of immigration enforcement and otherwise is distinct. We're already seeing today's inauguration day the possibility that Trump is going to try to revoke birthright citizenship in all kinds of ways. So there's legal standards, there's constitutional principles that make the situations distinct, but I think taken together, you really can draw important lessons, and I think one of them is that the post 1989 era of globalization is just decisively over. That this moment when there was kind of unquestioned faith in the ability of free markets to operate soundly and just to unleash capital goods, people to move across borders, and that this would create safer and more prosperous and more harmonious societies has certainly proved not to be the case. And I think that there are interesting also questions about getting back to the way that Schengen operates according to a kind of a civic and humanist logic and also an economic logic. So, what does it mean that there is a backlash to Schengen? Is that expressing some form of xenophobia, or is that a backlash to a kind of race to the bottom in terms of some economic standards and influx of workers, which have lowered wages and so on and so forth? And in the US, I think there are similar questions to be asked about what are the parts of the country that are most fearful of immigration. In some cases, it's not even the places where there are most immigrants, but it's the places that have been lashed by the end of the manufacturing economy and the outsourcing of jobs. So answering some of these economic questions, I think, will help also bring clarity about what exactly do these populations want and envision when it comes to immigration and human mobility.
Isaac Stanley-Becker, author of the new book, Europe Without Borders, A Compelling History of the Schengen Zone. Thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you, David. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.